The recording now, and you're good to state your name and do the same thing again. Thank you.
Nancy. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation today on diverse communities facing multiple barriers to engagement in patient-oriented research. We'd like to share with you some insights that we've gained working with our immigrant and refugee partners and participants. My name is Nancy Clark, and I'm with the School of Nursing at the University of Victoria. And my colleague and principal investigator, Dr. Davina Banner, will also be presenting, and she's the associate professor at the School of Nursing and adjunct in the medical program at the University of Northern British Columbia. We're joining you today from multiple territories. I'm joining you from the Algonquin-speaking peoples, and also Davina is joining us from Northern BC and the Tlayatne peoples.
Thank you so much. We'd like to first acknowledge our funders. This study was funded by the BC Support Unit and Canadian Institutes of Health Research. We'd also like to acknowledge the larger team. Team members include Dr. Sue Mills, Dr. Damon Condola, Karan Gang, Joyce Griffiths, who will be joining us today, Mariam Zanadi, Ursula Ellis, and in particular, we'd like to acknowledge our patient partner, Barbara Kroom, who unfortunately was unable to join us today, as well as Daisy O from Mosaic and Russ Maynard from the Portland Hotel Society. So today we'll speak very briefly about our research question and methods, but we're very excited to share with you some of the findings from our immigrant and refugee populations data. So patient-oriented research has emerged as a new tradition. While it's gained increasing popularity over recent years, it does build on a strong foundation of community-engaged research. And so while healthcare organisations across the globe are challenged to develop and implement services that best meet the needs of patients and communities, we know there's a gap in how patients' needs, values, and priorities are understood and enacted. We note in particular that there is a need to build capacity for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that we need to advance knowledge and support for patients who face barriers to engagement. First, we'll take a step back and hand over to Nancy, where we'll talk about intersectionality.
Thanks, Davina. The term intersectionality is really an umbrella term that promotes an understanding of human beings as shaped by interaction of different social locations. For example, our ethnic background, indigeneity, our gender, sexual orientation, even our migration status and our age or our ability or disability. And as some of you might be aware, the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. However, the central idea has long historical roots in Black activist, feminist, Latina, post-colonial, queer, and Indigenous scholarship. So since the 80s, scholars and activists and health researchers have used intersectionality as an analytic tool to help us understand how these identity factors are shaped, but also how they interact with the social structures that shape equitable healthcare outcomes. So it's an interesting lens to approach and use related to patient-oriented research, where our patients are becoming increasingly diverse.
So our research question: well, what are meaningful methods of engaging communities who experience multiple barriers to participating in patient-oriented research in British Columbia? Our project encompasses 3 phases. The first is a scoping literature review. Through this, we wish to understand what knowledge exists about patient-oriented research, and in particularly in patient-oriented research with populations that face barriers. Our second phase, which we'll be focusing on today, includes interviews with 30 to 40 participants from diverse backgrounds and roles. That is, we were really interested in learning the perspectives and experiences of those engaged in POR. And finally, we'll move into a period of KT where we will look to develop tools and resources that best serve those communities. During this phase 2 work, we conducted interviews with patient-oriented research teams that are engaged in research with diverse communities. We attempted where possible to achieve diversity in our sample, and we reached out initially through our own networks and then through snowball sampling. Through our interviews, we explored the role and experiences of partnerships in patient-oriented research, some of the challenges experienced, how identity shapes participation, as well as methods for ensuring safety and inclusion, and finally, evaluation. How do we know when we get it right? As we can see, we had a wide range of participants that took part in this study. These spanned multiple roles. We completed 35 interviews in total with 37 participants. Our age range was a mean of 48 years, and you can see we had more females than males that took part. Through our analysis, we undertook thematic analysis facilitated by NVivo 12. We did this as a team, coding and analysing the data carefully, as well as engaging in stages of interpretation with our patient and community partners. And as before, our analysis was shaped by an intersectionality lens.
Emerging themes. Our community partners and researchers identified the importance of relational practice and the need to work in direct partnership with our community partners in inquiring what they need and what their priorities are when identifying shared goals and visions. Respecting the values, perspectives, opinions, and knowledge of community partners is critical in building relationships and trust. Being aware that they are the experts as well and have diverse ways of knowing and worldviews. It is also critically important as researchers to be reflexive of our own biases, assumptions, and focusing not only on our agenda and also with no background research or attempts to getting to know our community partners. It's also being important to be mindful of our power imbalances and the use of language, for instance, vulnerabilities of persons and the risk of sharing their experiences, and also focusing on strengths and not only disparities.
Thanks, Joyce. We also found that there were several overlapping barriers to engagement across our participant groups. For example, the use of technology, access to technology, while it can promote access to meaningful engaging with our community partners, there are also some challenges related to use of technology and literacy around that. And so also included with that would be language and culture. And so it's really important to build trust and establish meaningful relationships as well. We wanted to mitigate or try to understand how the barriers of technology could be mitigated. And so this was really related to not only having access, but being flexible. And as you can see in the excerpts here, people are willing and able to do the work if it's facilitated by the community partners, and in order to bring the voice of our participants forward.
Language resources are important in mitigating literacy barriers, and the use of multiple resources in various languages is greatly beneficial. Researchers and community partners commented on the importance of community partners being included in the planning, development, implementation, and evaluation of resources that reflect accurate information that is understandable, linguistically and culturally appropriate. Emphasis was placed on the importance of researchers having knowledge and awareness of trauma and violence-informed approach, focusing on open and respectful dialogue, and building relationships with community partners that extend beyond the research process, and ensuring outputs are what the community needs and wants based on their knowledge, perspectives, language, and culture.
And so we mentioned earlier that we took an intersectionality lens, and that really helped us to not only look at the diversity of our participants, but also attend to the structures, some of which we were talking about, such as use of technology. And in this slide, we just wanted to highlight sort of how identities were also negotiated and how diverse they were. For example, researchers could also be patients, and patients could also be researchers. Community members also sat within those liminal spaces. So that was something that needed to be, or that we found quite novel. The other interesting finding was that we needed to recognize the complex not only the structures, but how power was situated and reshaped depending on the position of the patient partner and the community. And these excerpts speak to that. I think inherent in the work that I do, just acknowledging that there is a power difference and to be really aware of that, and then to be reflexive and develop strategies to try and be more inclusive given the multiple identities and roles that people had.
And that touches on the importance of promoting safety. Researchers have a responsibility to work in solidarity and accountability with community partners that are facilitating research. Ethical engagement with immigrant and refugees in research is addressed, but not always mainstream. For the most difficult to reach, community groups require the most amount of trust because they carry the most vulnerability. For example, looking at community partners and seeking advice, such as perhaps interview techniques, seeking out the advice of a community partners such as Mosaic, and how to best formulate questions, practical issues such as registration process, time, confidentiality, etc., to mitigate barriers to patient-oriented research. Promoting safety, researchers have a responsibility to work in solidarity and accountability with community partners that are facilitating research. Ethical engagement with immigrant and refugees in research is addressed, but not always mainstream. For the most difficult to reach, community groups require the most amount of trust because they carry the most vulnerability. For example, seeking the advice of community partners such as interviewing techniques, such as Mosaic, and how to best formulate questions, practical issues such as registration process, time, confidentiality, etc., to mitigate barriers to patient-oriented research. And like Nancy had spoken to previously, the importance of trust. And one of our partners commented, I try to support them as much as I can. So that's why they trust me for the past many years. When I do research, it reduces my obstacles when I approach to them, and they trust me.
So making partnerships work was really about attending to researcher reflexivity, and that also you have a budget and time that can allow for making those, creating those spaces of trust, because this takes time with community partners, and also resources. And from the patient perspective, that the responsibility of the patient partner is quite high, and the resources needed to support our patient partners is a huge commitment. And so we learned quite a bit, and we'd like to share with you some resource tools that we think could be helpful to mitigate the barriers in patient-oriented research. For example, we did use intersectionality as a lens, but there's also a toolkit that you can use around knowledge translation, which really looks at how we can be reflexive as researchers and patient partners in the process. There's some health literacy tools available. And one of our favorites is the BC Support Unit Plain Language Guide, valuable in terms of resources that we have to help us do that meaningful work. And also the patient engagement heard and valued also speaks to diversity when we think of patient-oriented research. So we'd like to share those tools and resources with you.
We'd finally like to just thank you for joining us today, and we welcome your questions. Thank you again for joining us. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge our funders. This project is funded by the BC Support Unit and Canadian Institutes of Health Research. We'd also like to acknowledge our larger team, our project co-leads, Barbara Kroon, patient partner, and Dr. Sue Mills of the University of British Columbia, as well as Damon Candola, Karan Gang, Joyce Griffiths, who's joining us today, Mariam Donadi, Ursula Ellis, Daisy O from Mosaic, and Russ Maynard from the Portland Hotel Society.